Welcome back to Genetics in the Paddock with Emily. I'm your host, Emily Johnston, and I'll be taking you along on my journey to learn about all things genetics in extensive livestock. Last season, we explored the foundational aspects of genetics. We discussed everything from basic genetic principles to practical applications on farm. This season, we're kicking it up a notch. For today's episode, we have two guest speakers, Dr. Linda Cave and Brett Littler. In this episode, we'll discuss 30 years worth of research on muscling in beef cattle. This is an episode I can guarantee you'll want to stick around for, and one you'll enjoy. So with that, let's get into it. So welcome back to another episode of Genetics in the Paddock with Emily. Today I'm joined by two special guest speakers, and this is a double episode today. So today I'm joined by Linda Cave and Brett Littler, and I'd like to just say a big thank you to start with for both of you carving out some time out of your day to sit down and have a bit of a chat.
No problem.
No worries.
So just to kick us off, I might just get you guys to just tell the audience just a little bit about yourself. Could be, the role you're in, what you're currently working on, just however broad you want to go is fine. So we might start off with Linda.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Hi, my name's Linda Cave. I'm a research officer with DPI RD based in Armidale. I've been working with the department since 2002 on various livestock research projects, some COC ones and quite a few MLA projects in various areas depending on what's going at the time.
And I'm Brett Littler. I'm currently working in the local land services, a senior land service officer, part of the drought adaptation team, but I've been employed with the government now coming up 30 years as a extension advisory officer and was a livestock officer with DPI, in particular beef cattle officer, for 17 years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for both of your intros. It sounds like we have a broad range of experience here, which will be great to unpack the topic we're talking about today. So today we're going to be talking about a long-term Australian study that ran from the 90s up until recently in 2020. And the study was examining muscle scoring in beef cattle. So I might just get one of you to start off with just telling me a bit about the study and particularly why it came about and what it was trying to achieve, just to kind of set the scene a little bit for some of the later topics that we're going to discuss.
Well, the original work came together basically from work that had been done in the late 80s, early 90s, looking at muscle score. And muscle score was a way to describe the overall saleable meat yield of an animal. There was some conjecture and a few issues when sort of that work was done about some negative influences that possibly had. And one of the guys who did the research work was a bloke by the name of Bill McKinn, who's now deceased, was very technically good livestock officer, extreme level of knowledge. And he went, bugger this, I want to actually see whether some of these claims that he was starting to get, the pushback from some of the breeders, from some of the statements that you really, if you start chasing muscling in beef breeding females, that you'd start to have a negative effect on milking, weaning, breeding. They won't calve down, you'll do this, and it was all negative. And when Bill was sort of looking at it and working with some key producers, they were sort of giving the message that, hey, no, we've got some very heavily muscled British females and we're not seeing negative effects. These cows are weaning, they're calves, they're breeding, we're not having to pull calves, they're milking, their weaning weights are right up there. So Bill went, right, okay, we need to shut the naysayers up, and how do we do that? So Bill, sort of on a shoestring budget, there was no budget, started to look at doing this work of down at Camden, down at EMAI, with the cow herd on there with the station manager at the time, and they started sourcing bulls that were high muscle bulls and low muscle bulls and joining those animals over the cows and looking at those progenies and then serially assessing those animals throughout their life and the like. So that's where it all started. It then developed up where all of a sudden it started chasing it further and further. And I think that's when you started to become involved, Linda.
Yeah, pretty much. I started with the herd in around about 2004, helping Bill, and then ran it from 2011 to 2020. So I think I got the easy end because the selection lines have been established. That was a really great resource set up to then do research on. So we did that with help from funding from MLA as well. Looked at a lot of the carcass meat quality, feedlot growth, feed efficiency, maternal productivity, and some other scientific and gene expression stuff as well. Sort of got done there along the way.
Yeah, and the herd had the divergent line, and like in the early days, it really was the high muscle lines and the low muscle lines, and part of the selection of the bulls that went in, and I remember going to sales and buying bulls for Bill. Bill would buy a lot of the bulls. We had to have EBVs of bulls that were similar. We just didn't want to skew the results one way or the other. They had to be sort of 600 day
weight. Yeah, like average bulls. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, and sort of making sure that we're chasing animals that were available out in the industry as well when we were going and selecting, and we did put a lot of time in going and chasing the correct animals to use, and these. I remember going to a number of different sales, and you'd get a low bull here, you'd get a high bull there, and in the early days they did get a lot of high bulls from a couple of particular studs that were breeding cattle, and the base cattle that we were using were Angus, so it was commercially available Angus cattle.
Thanks for sharing that, guys. It's really interesting to hear about the setup of the project and also why it came about. I'm interested to dive a bit more into where we are now, because the study has gone on for quite some time. So how much control do we actually have over improving muscling in cattle? And can selecting animals purely based on their muscle scores actually boost profit?
Yeah, definitely. We saw the work early on that, and the original muscling work that Bill had done, Bill and Sandy and Diana Perry did some of the original work with the muscling. We knew that selecting animals for muscling, that we got an increase in dressing percentage, we got an increase in retail beef yield. We also, with some of those better muscle lines, we saw animals that were trimmed, and sort of that work came through. In the early days, we looked at market signals were there. So one of the things that we did look at was from the National Livestock Reporting Service, where they're reporting at sale, and we were seeing sort of anywhere, depending on the category of animals and the live weights involved, anywhere from 15 up to 30 cents a kilogram variation in animals based on muscle score, whereas fat score, it was only sort of 2 to 5 cents. Cows, it was a little bit bigger spread because bigger, heavier, fatter cows, it was a bigger discount for those overfat cows. Weight categories, once again, it was only small amounts, and the real big driver of some of those differences in price per kilogram reported through the National Livestock Reporting Service was on muscularity. So that was sort of one of the things that we really did look at.
Yeah, and we know that retail beef yield is one of the largest drivers of profitability in the beef industry, so it's a pretty big thing to change. You can definitely change it. It's heritable, so the research has shown that muscle scores are heritable, and so it can be changed in your herd.
And some of the commercial producers that Bill had been heavily involved in, and I've subsequently done some work with, it was not, we were seeing that some of those producers who had been selecting for muscling were getting animals when they were trading over the hooks that were dressing, 2, 3 and 4% above the norm for those animals going into those markets. So from a dollar sense, that's a fair bit of money when you start looking at the change in carcass weight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always important to talk about the economic value of it as well, because it's a very important part to driving businesses. So we spoke a little bit just then about fat versus muscle. So I'm interested to kind of touch on that a little bit more. So what sort of correlations exist between muscle and fatness traits? And are there any sort of implications that you can think of for producers that are aiming to select for muscle score without negatively impacting some other economically important traits?
So what we've found in the research is that the genetic correlations between muscle score and fatness are weak. Similarly with the relationship between muscle score and live weight. So that means that you can select for a better muscle score, but you can also select for better fatness traits. So you don't have to really lose out on your fatness by increasing your muscling. And we definitely saw that in our lines. We didn't have issues with finishing off our higher muscled animals. They had slightly less fat than the lower muscled animals, but those relationships are not so strong that you can't select an animal that does both.
And those animals were meeting the specs, because this was a commercial project that the animals actually went through. We had animals going in and being slaughtered at different markets, different places, and they were still hitting those specifications that the processors had, so meeting the minimum fat specifications, meeting MSA grading and the like as well.
Yeah, thanks guys. That sounds really important to note, especially as I'm assuming a lot of people also want to increase their fatness. So one of the things that we spoke about earlier on, and I'm guessing a bit of a basis as to why the project started, was about females being feminine, and I say that with quotation marks. So can we just talk a little bit more about that? And particularly, can breeding cows who have more muscle, does it impact fertility or any sort of maternal productivity traits or reproduction, anything like that?
Yeah, so second you said feminine, I sort of cringed and went, oh geez, here we go, that little cherub. It's a term that we hear running around the show ring a lot and the like. I hate it with a vehement passion.
What are they, ones with long eyelashes or something?
Oh, they've got real pretty hair. There are words that people use with it, but I keep saying to people, don't you put your glasses on to try to work it out. Let the bull sort it out. And that was really one of these things, why this project was set up, because part of the discussion about a feminine cow was tended to be a negative thing to muscling. Like, so the second you got a better muscled female, people are going, oh, she's not feminine. But, we had these commercial herds that were breeding successfully, going through droughts and not having a problem. So, that was really the premise, because we still hear this, and I was at a junior judging event recently, literally last week, and one of the people goes, oh, she's more feminine. And I just went, explain that term to me. Why are you putting that on? Is that going to have felt sorry for the poor kid at the end of it? But it's one of those ones that we hear very regularly. And when we know that sort of one of the things that has happened over time is when people have started talking to femininity, they've really cut down on those animals and sort of went, oh, it's got muscling, it's not as feminine. But we know, and Linda will be able to back this up with the hard numbers, that if you haven't got muscling in your females, you won't have very heavily muscled steers. So you've got to have that muscling in your female lines, and unfortunately there for a long time femininity has been used to bash females that have got a bit of muscularity about them, unfortunately.
Yeah, and as Brett said, from the research data, we really didn't find any negatives of selecting for, I probably haven't explained it that well, but our high muscle line, where we selected the highest muscled Angus bulls we could find that we knew didn't have any of the extreme myostatin genes, we couldn't find any negatives in the maternal productivity in any way of those breeds. Their calving ability, weaning weights, kilograms of calf weaned per cow joined, there was never any drop in those cows compared to the lower muscled cows. So, they look pretty good to me, those B cows with a nice big calf at foot. Thought they were feminine enough. But...
And those cows too that have got that muscularity are worth more the other end. Same story, they're dressing heavier. It's an industry number that we'll see running around where we talk about, cows dressing under 50%. We had lots of our cows that were in that high muscle lines dressing well over 50-odd%. And I know with some commercial producers that I've worked with, there's very little variation between their steers and their heifers when they send them off and go get them processed. So it's those cows were producing a calf, and the metrics were live calf through to weaning was the variation, and they were doing that. And then to top it all off, that cow's worth more at the end as well. And we're seeing those cows because they weren't having some of the trim issues we get with some of those over-fat cows and the like. They're dressing heavier, don't have the fat trim, so all of a sudden as a saleable carcass out the back end, they're also worth a lot more money as well because you're getting more trim cuts, etc., so mince and the like as well.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for clearing that up. I think that's some really strong messaging as well, particularly that there's nothing wrong with having a very muscular female. So yeah, thanks so much for having input on that one, guys. And Linda, there was something that you just mentioned that I picked up on as you were speaking, and it was about myostatin. And I know that sometimes there can be a bit of confusion or a lot of questioning around myostatin. So can we briefly just talk about what the myostatin gene is, and should producers be deliberately selecting for this gene or should they be avoiding it? I just kind of want to unpack that a little bit more and make that a bit clearer.
Yeah, so if we go back to basics, myostatin is a protein which limits muscle growth. There are a lot of known mutations in that gene currently, but there'd be a lot that we don't know that are probably smaller effect as well. Some of them, so in that myostatin gene, there are mutations that then reduce the functionality of the myostatin, which then allow muscles to grow larger. So through selecting for high-muscled bulls in this project, one of the large effect myostatin mutations came into the herd, and that was the one that's known to be one of the Belgian blue mutations, MT821. So we studied that as a third line as well, because that gene definitely gave extra couple of percent of retail beef yield, gave an extra kick to your muscle score. So it was really interesting to add it to the science to see what was going on there.
And do you think livestock producers should be deliberately selecting or for or against myostatin?
There are some challenges with it, depending on how large an effect one it is. One copy is really useful, but you don't really want two copies if they become a bit less functional, and you can get some issues coming in. So you really need to be testing your animals if you've got that in your herd. A lot of herds have it. A lot of the myostatin genes are in small percentages in all of our British breeds. They pop up here and there, whether it's from people crossing to those other breeds at some stage or not. It's not sort of that definite, but
yeah. And look, that gene's out there. But it's not huge. I know in the early days when all of a sudden we went, hey, presto, we've got this myostatin gene, the genetic tech, because bear in mind this work started before our gene technology kicked in.
Yeah, 2005, some of the genes.
So all of a sudden, I still remember in the early days getting the phone call saying, go start pulling hairs out. If you see something that you think's got the gene, pull the hair out, we'll get it down to Brendan, get it tested. I pulled hair samples out of red poles, I pulled hair samples out of shorthorns, I pulled hair samples out of Braffords, Santa Gertrudis, multiple, and like different animals, you were seeing around. In Yeovil, I still remember this shorthorn heifer that I saw and just went, wow, you've got to have a copy. Grab the hair sample, send it off, and it actually had that same deletion gene that was in the Belgian blue, and so they're out there, just not very much. So I would have hated to think how many thousands of cattle I looked at looking for it, and it was rare occasions, like extremely rare occasions, it was popping up.
Some producers are using it unknowingly.
But they're managing it too, and they know what it does and doesn't do. And that's probably the big thing. If you've got the awareness that it's there, manage it. But if you haven't got it there, a little bit of it goes a long way and will give you a big kick. And then once you introduce it, then it comes back to managing it. Because once you go to the full extent, it does definitely have some negative sort of some things can pop up, and being aware of that and managing it, they fatigue quicker, they're more likely to cut dark and that type of stuff, those extreme variants of the deletion genes.
2 copies, if you get 2 copies of it, You've
got to have 2 copies, and that's right, Linda.
One copy's good, 2 copies you don't really want to. It might depend on your breed and your base. So if you're adding 2 copies on top of the heavily muscled animals, they're going to get really extreme. But adding it to lower ones, it might be quite as bad. But you don't know by looking really what myostatin genes those animals might have in them.
And I think it did come up because one of the herds that we picked in the original formation of the trying to do this trial was a herd that had it in there, and that's how we really picked it up. And the original stuff when Bill was doing this was he was trying to get us so that we could really test this theory that these muscular and try to get the divergence of the lines. Bill went hard, and I remember Bill saying to me, he said, unless it's B+, I don't want to see it. And so on a muscle score scale, we're going 15-point scale A+ is something that I generally just say for my double muscled animals, all the way down to an E- down the bottom end. We're chasing what we knew is going to be less than sort of 6% of the beef herd is getting into that B+ and above category. It's very small.
In the British breeds,
British breed, sorry, Sorry, caveats.
That's all right. We know what we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys. I think that's a really useful discussion. I think it was something that was important that we spoke about within this episode, just to bring a bit of light into the myostatin conversation. So I think some key takeaways from that was it's important to understand via testing or understanding how to manage it as well, which is, really, really good to hear. And in my episodes, I always like to ask a little bit of a sustainability question, seeing as it's quite an important topic at the moment. So I was just wondering, are heavily muscled animals more resilient or better in some of these more challenging climates, especially because I guess we're having more extreme weather events and whatnot at the moment, and it's predicted to continue. So is there any benefit to having them in these sort of conditions?
Well, what we really found over 30 years, we had a lot of different challenges in the environment. Generally, they all were as resilient as each other. So even going to using the myostatin gene, selecting for high or low muscle, their health, the need to feed in a drought, and that sort of, the tail end of a herd was never for the high muscled animals. It was always a combination, a mixture. So I don't know that they're more resilient, but they're definitely not less resilient for that benefit that you get. They always look better to me. They hold their fat well, and once they've lost a bit of weight, they look like stronger animals still, but they performed as well as the lower muscled animals. Do you have a different perspective, Brett?
Oh, my perspective is they hang on, definitely, because both energy and muscle are fat reserves. We know energy from a pure nutrition point of view takes less energy to put on muscle than it does to put on fat. And when you then trigger that back over, we know from the bottom end, and this is part of the welfare work which is obviously separate to this type of stuff, but where we looked at these cows, a more heavily muscled animal has got more reserves to eat into. So from a sustainability point of view, we know they will hang on and they'll perform. And that was part of the original stuff too, the Bill. That was one of the big cherubs that in the early days where people are going, they don't hang on in a drought, they fall in a heap and all the rest of it. And we went through the millennium drought with them, and I still remember the back end of the 90s down at Camden was woeful down there when I first came. And these cows were breeding, they were performing and going. So it's one of those ones, you feed them, manage them with sustainability. So there is some definite sort of benefit from conversion, if you like, so when you start doing it purely on maths. Energy per kilo of muscle, energy per kilo of fat.
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually intentionally, we split the herd into low and high nutrition for a 3-year project with MLA, about 2012, 11, 12, 13, and ran the low nutrition animals, so equal groups reached the 3 lines pretty hard. They lost about 150 kilos of their body weight. And we really saw that they utilised the tissues that they had. So the low cows used more fat, the high cows used more muscle. After 3 years on the low nutrition, it was only the cows with the myostatin gene actually dropped their fertility, so their calving rates, a little bit more than the low and high lines, but that was the only negative. But they were run pretty hard, which you might have to do in a drought if we have an extended drought. But then we followed them afterwards and they put those tissues back on. So interesting.
Yeah, and they were run hard. I still remember seeing them there at Grafton, and that they'd mobilised a fair bit of what they had. And obviously when we're taking from a production point of view, if we were trying to push things with research approval and the like to take them down to a low extent. But from a practical standpoint, most of the producers that I saw would never take their cows. They'd be intervening quicker, weaning, feeding earlier and things like that. But at the end of the day too, like those cows have got that reserve, and that's part of the base that we used to have. That work from those cows was then why we sort of, with some of our welfare stuff, where we sort of said, okay, we need to take in the muscle and the fat, because all of a sudden a cow that's got no muscling and it's got no fat is in trouble. Whereas a cow that's got muscling and no fat has still got an energy reserve before it starts to become a problem. So that's part of the work that we looked at.
That's with your fit to load stuff, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you so much. That was a great discussion. And I think, sustainability is always very interesting to me. And can I just say, I'm enjoying hearing from both of your experiences too, particularly because you've, watched this project evolve over a fair amount of time and had also hands-on involvement. So it's really, really great to hear just the discussion between both of you after each question. So I guess putting some of this research back into a bit more of a practical on-ground perspective. So we don't have a direct muscle EBV at the moment. So how can producers go about improving muscling in their herds? Should we be using, EBVs like retail beef yield or eye muscle area, marbling? What should we be doing at the moment if people do want to improve muscling in their herds?
Yeah, we haven't. I mean, I think we've been interested all the way along, but the issue with creating a muscle score EBV is having enough trained, reliable assessors to put the information in. So that's why we don't have one at the moment. So there is the eye muscle area EBV, but I think everybody knows, but from our data, we certainly saw that the muscle score trait and the EBV trait are definitely not the same thing. So if like for increased eye muscle area EBV, you probably will get higher eye muscle areas, but not necessarily whole body by selecting on one muscle. And similar for the RBY EBV, there's not a lot of data driving that. It's based on muscle area and fatness traits as well. So they're quite indirect. Still, really the best way is to go and look at the bulls and pick your B pluses and use those over your cows.
Yeah, and from a practical standpoint, when I talk to producers about going out and picking their bulls, and there's some producers out there who do it and do it on their ear, they know what they're looking at. What I say to most producers, if you can't assess for fat, don't try to assess muscle. You need to be able to break that picture up in between them. And the thing to remember with muscling, it's overall body. We're not just looking at an individual muscle, and we'll get some lines of cattle that are really good on the top line but lack volume down through. I think Wagyu's very good up in the front forequarter, don't look great down the back hindquarter. So when we're muscle scoring those animals, we're making allowances for what we're seeing, that shape, and that's that overall body and the overall retail beef yield that we do look at. What I would say from a practical standpoint is we've got a lot of producers out there that can assess that muscularity, but you really need someone who knows what they're looking at, is trained at it and can do it. And that's always been the problem with this, is just some of the repeatability. We've got a few people that are very good at muscle scoring, and Bill and Sandy Yates, the original two guys, they were terrific. Their repeatability, they could run hundreds of animals around, you'd run them back through and they'd be great. But some of that repeatability and the ability to assess without fatness is sort of a bit lacking. So the EBVs for retail beef yield and that are a tool, but picking for muscling, nothing beats it. It's still, if you want to increase muscling in your herd, you've got to actually physically look at those animals, look at that thickness, that width, the volume throughout, how it carries it back down through the top line, and looking for that shape that we talk about.
I mean, you work with the 3D cameras, and Malcolm McPhee are trying to set up a system that can objectively measure muscle score and other things as well. If that became commercialised, you actually could then create an EBV for muscle score if you could get enough, you'd actually be able to get the data then. It's not quite there yet, I don't think, but it might take some of the subjectivity out of it.
Yeah, and that repeatability, all of a sudden you're not relying on a few people that's got their R squares, then repeatability on their assessment. So there's only a couple of us left. It's definitely, if we could get something like 3D camera working repeatably, quick, easy, something like that then could be used also with the ultrasound scanners, where there's a camera that as they come in, something like that. There's a couple of scanners out there who are pretty bloody good at assessing for muscling and assessing for fat.
Yep.
Definitely if we could get that camera, sort of some way of doing it. And the original stuff that they did look at, Bill looked at the stifle hip width relationship, or width stifle relationship, and volume at the back end. We look at that thickness through the back end depending on the shape that we see. Some of the original work that Bill actually did, and I was flicking through a couple of slides just as a bit of a presentation of joys of having Bill's old stuff, and the original stuff actually was the front forearm. Yeah, the circumference of the front forearm was really good for overall levels of muscularity and tying that in. But from a practical standpoint, Emily, there's a lot to be gained out there in the industry. The original stuff we know, so back in the 90s and stuff, when Sandy and Bill and Diana did the original work, they went to abattoirs, did assessments of cattle and followed them through. The average British bred steer was running at a C-. Average British bred female was running at a D+. We have not seen that move. So there's a lot to be gained out in the industry just by moving it that little bit. And you're not going to get anywhere near that myostatin or bend. But even if we can get that population curve to move from a C- to a C+, the overall population, that's a huge amount of money. And all of a sudden, you've got females that are killing up and got the same value of yield. And I know, looking at sort of some of that stuff, the value of a carcass, yep, you've got your marbling in certain cuts, but it's all about how much meat you're going to get out the back end.
Yeah, thank you so much. Honestly, it sounds like there's a couple of challenges still hanging around, but it also sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for growth in this space, in the technology, as well as just moving the industry average forward. And I mean, if it directly correlates to profit, I'm sure it's probably a big interest to a lot of people. So yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that. I think the 3D cameras and ultrasounding technology sounds like a really interesting space that I'm personally quite interested to keep an eye on in the future and see if it can help with improving muscle scoring, or even just being able to collect some more data on that, given the challenges with having people trained and able to do it, and different scoring systems, and yeah, all of the things that you guys just highlighted then. I guess just to wrap up the episode, I'm interested just to see, do you think in the current climate that muscularity is maybe undervalued?
Definitely for some producers it is. It's been around the whole time I've been in my career. They've looked at value-based payment systems, and every time I turn up at a meeting we hear some of them. There's data there. We know that some of these animals, and I'm think back to some research work that Wilco did, John Wilkinson, some of the work that some of the processors have done with some of those better muscle blinds. With some cattle, we're getting up to, so cattle in a feedlot situation fed for mid-fed type feed, so over 100 days, there can be up to 12% variation in saleable meat yield out the other end. So that is huge. You look at 12% of a 300, 400 kilo carcass, that's a lot of money. And they're seeing that there, and I know there's been work there. So down the track with things like Viscan, different cameras, maybe some of that stuff, Dexter's there is that talk and everything else like that. I think we know it's there, but the problem is the signals haven't been getting out to some of the producers. Your processors definitely know that, they've got some lines that they know they get the dollars out the other end. They love them. They don't get your trims up. They don't have as much fat waste, etc., etc. So we know it's just that difficulty of just getting it. Once we get the process to go, here's a value-based payment system, this is what it's worth, all of a sudden we'll see some things move very quickly. But now, currently, the thing we've got is the averaging. And the only time I see some of these lines of animals going through is basically when things get a bit tight and all of a sudden they'll jump queues. We know this bloke's cattle will perform. We know these ones will hang up and do this, bang. We know these bloke's cattle do this. They'll come into a feedlot quicker when everyone else is trying to get in. So
yeah, thank you so much for sharing your opinion. I think it's a nice way to wrap up the episode, particularly because we've spoken about, a whole lot of things to do with muscles. So thank you so much for sharing that. And that brings us to the end of today's episode, which I've personally really enjoyed speaking to the both of you. I think it's nice to have a conversation that's three-way and a few different opinions and experiences as well. And you guys having a similar but different background has added a lot of value to this episode. So thank you so much for sitting down to chat with me today. I know you're both very busy people, so I appreciate the hour that you've put aside on a Friday of all days. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Emily and Linda. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks for the chat. I should just say, Emily, most of the work from the Muscling Herd's published, so if people want to see more detailed information, they can contact us, or some things are on the DPIRD website and the Prime Facts. If people want a bit more information, it's out and about.
Wonderful.
And also there's information on the bovine language. It's got muscle scores in describing it and the like. There's also some YouTube clips that Todd Andrews and myself have done on fat and muscle assessment that's out there. So people are interested in actually looking at how to do it. That's definitely an option as well. But the bovine language has got some diagrams and etc. and good descriptors of how to assess the muscularity, but so does DPI with some of the publications.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really important to note, and I'm sure a lot of people will also want to follow up on a few of these things and probably brush up on some muscle scoring. So I'll be sure to pop those in the show notes. Thanks again, guys, and until next time. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Genetics in the Paddock with Emily. I hope you found our discussion as enlightening as I did. This episode was produced by the extensive livestock genetics team within the New South Wales Government. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to our podcast on your favourite platform, leaving us a review and sharing it with your friends and colleagues. Your feedback and support help us grow and reach more people who are passionate about livestock genetics. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics or people you'd like to hear on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on emily.johnston@dpi.newsouthwales.gov.au. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.